In a small town in Colorado, Michael Parker, a 32-year-old engineer, lived a quiet, structured life. He worked at the local energy company, maintaining the electrical grid and overseeing small infrastructure projects. His routine was predictable, working long hours, occasionally meeting up with friends and visiting his family a few times a year. Despite the stability, something always felt missing. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that his life lacked deeper meaning. He longed for a family of his own, something to give his life a sense of purpose, beyond work. While many of his friends from college and work had already settled down, Michael found himself living in a state of emotional stagnation. His job was rewarding in its own way, and he appreciated the quiet of his evenings alone, but he felt the absence of something more fulfilling. He wanted a partner, someone with whom he could share his life and eventually raise a family. It was a thought that increasingly occupied his mind. Michael had tried dating in the past, but nothing ever lasted long enough to become meaningful. One evening, a close friend invited him to a small gathering at his home. It was the kind of casual event Michael usually avoided, just a few drinks and conversation with familiar faces. He didn't expect much from the evening, but on this particular night, something changed. Michael met Grace Thompson, a charming and intelligent woman who immediately caught his attention. Grace worked as a librarian in the town's small library. She had a quiet but engaging personality, and there was something about her that intrigued him. Grace, like Michael was in her early 30s, and had been living a similarly quiet life. She enjoyed her work at the library, finding peace in the order and tranquility of her surroundings. When they met at the party, the conversation between them flowed naturally. They discussed books, local history, and their shared sense of longing for something more meaningful in their lives. Grace was both warm and thoughtful, and Michael found himself drawn to her almost immediately. Over the next few weeks, they began seeing each other more often. Michael quickly realized that Grace was different from anyone he had met before. She shared his values, his aspirations, and most importantly, his desire for a family. Their relationship grew quickly, but organically. They spent long evenings together, often talking late into the night about their hopes for the future. For the first time in years, Michael felt like he was on the right path, as though Grace was the missing piece he had been searching for. Their romance developed into something serious after only a few months. Michael, who had always been cautious about relationships, found himself feeling confident about Grace. He began to think about their future in a way he hadn't with anyone else. One evening, while sitting on a quiet bench overlooking the town's small lake, Michael proposed. It was an impulsive decision, but it felt right. Grace accepted with joy, and in that moment, Michael felt a sense of completeness he hadn't experienced before. With the engagement came a new chapter in their lives. They both threw themselves into wedding planning, excited about the future they were building together. Grace was meticulous in her plans, and Michael supported her, relieved to have found someone who shared his vision for the future. They began looking at venues, picking out invitations, and discussing who they wanted to invite. Everything seemed perfect. Michael finally felt like his life had meaning. However, as the excitement of the engagement settled, small doubts started to creep into Michael's mind. Though he loved Grace deeply, he couldn't help but feel a subtle tension that he couldn't fully explain. It was a quiet unease that seemed to come from nowhere, something lurking beneath the surface of their otherwise perfect relationship. Still, he pushed these feelings aside, attributing them to normal pre-wedding nerves. After all, everything seemed to be going well. He had the job, the house, and now the woman he wanted to spend his life with. As the wedding approached, Michael and Grace decided it was time to formally introduce each other to their families and closest friends. Michael had already spoken fondly of his family, especially his younger brother, David Parker, 5 years younger than Michael, was a successful entrepreneur who had built his own business from the ground up. While Michael had chosen a steady career as an engineer, David had taken risks and thrived in the world of business, always chasing the next big opportunity. Despite their differences, Michael and David had always maintained a close relationship. Growing up, they had been each other's closest companions, though there was always a subtle tension. David's charisma and success had often shadowed Michael's quieter, more reserved nature, while Michael had never resented his brother. There were times when he couldn't help but feel like he was living in David's shadow. David's presence could be overwhelming, but Michael had long accepted that this was just how things were between them. Michael was eager to introduce Grace to his family, and he hoped the meeting would go smoothly. His parents were excited about the wedding, thrilled that Michael had finally found someone who made him happy. The family dinner was held at his parents' house, a small gathering that Michael had hoped would be relaxed and enjoyable. Grace quickly won over his parents with her warmth and genuine kindness. They admired her work at the library and were glad to see how happy she made their son. However, it was David's reaction that caught Michael's attention. From the moment Grace and David were introduced, Michael noticed something unsettling. It wasn't anything overt, just small moments. The way David's eyes lingered on Grace a little too long. The way Grace smiled at one of his jokes, the ease with which they conversed. Michael tried to ignore it, telling himself it was natural for David to charm anyone he met. After all, David had always been charismatic, and outgoing people were naturally drawn to him. The introduction to Grace's side of the family came a few weeks later. Grace's mother, Helen Thompson, lived in the same town and was thrilled about her daughter's engagement. Grace had always been close with her mother, especially after the death of her father, several years early. Helen welcomed Michael with open arms, grateful that her daughter had found someone who seemed dependable and kind. The dinner was more intimate than the one with Michael's family, as Grace's side was much smaller aside from her mother. Grace's best friend, Lauren Davis, was also present. Lauren had known Grace for years, and the two were inseparable. Michael appreciated how supportive Lauren was of Grace, always offering advice and encouragement. Lauren, always attuned to Grace's emotions, seemed to notice it too. She made a few offhand comments about Grace looking preoccupied, though she quickly laughed them off. Grace herself dismissed any concerns Michael might have had, attributing it all to the stress of wedding planning. Michael, however, couldn't help but feel like there was something deeper going on. He began paying closer attention to Grace's interactions, particularly when David was around in the weeks following. David started dropping by more often. At first it seemed like coincidence he'd come over to check in on the wedding plans or ask Michael about family matters, but each time Michael noticed that David's visits often coincided with times when Grace was alone at their house. Michael told himself it was all in his head. His natural inclination toward jealousy was something he'd always struggled with, and he didn't want to sabotage his relationship with Grace over something as trivial as his brother's charm. Still, the frequency of David's visits and the ease with which he and Grace interact. Ed left Michael feeling uneasy. He tried to talk to Grace about it once, but she brushed off his concerns, laughing and assuring him that she and David were simply getting along as future in-laws. Yet Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He found himself watching Grace more closely, noting small details in her behavior, her increased text messages, her late-night conversations that she claimed were with friends, and the way she seemed to light up when David entered the room. Michael didn't want to believe that anything inappropriate was happening, but the growing suspicion gnawed at him. But beneath the surface, doubts started to creep into Michael's mind. The initial excitement of their engagement had begun to fade, replaced by the weight of responsibility and pressure. At first it seemed like normal pre-wedding anxiety. Grace had taken on much of the planning herself, insisting that Michael focus on work while she handled the details. She assured him that everything was fine, but her behavior began to change in subtle ways that Michael couldn't ignore. Grace, who had always been open with Michael, started becoming more secretive. She began spending more time outside of the house, often claiming to be meeting with her friends or handling last-minute wedding errands. But these outings started to stretch longer than expected, and when Michael tried to reach her, her phone would often go unanswered. She would later explain away the missed calls with simple excuses. Her phone was on silence, the battery had died, or she was in the middle of something and couldn't respond. What unsettled Michael more than the unanswered calls was the increased presence of his brother, David, who had once been a rare visitor to their home, now seemed to be around constantly. He offered to help with the wedding, showing up unannounced to check on how things were going. At first, Michael appreciated the support, but it wasn't long before David's visits became a source of tension. It wasn't just the frequency of his visits, but the fact that he often appeared when Michael wasn't around. Grace assured him that David was simply trying to help, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on. He tried to rationalize it all. After all, wedding planning was notorious for causing stress and tension. Maybe Grace was simply overwhelmed with the details, and David was stepping in to lighten the load. Perhaps his own anxiety was clouding his judgment. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, the nagging doubts refused to go away. One evening, as Michael was working late in his home office, he overheard Grace on the phone. Her voice, usually calm and composed, sounded different, shaken, almost nervous. The door was slightly ajar, and though he couldn't make out the words, the tone of the conversation set off alarm bells in his head. Grace was speaking in hushed tones, her voice rising and falling in a way that suggested something was wrong. Michael strained to hear more, but she abruptly ended the call before he could catch any clear details. When Grace emerged from the room, her demeanor was composed, but there was something off about her. Smile. Michael asked who she had been talking to, and she casually replied that it was one of her friends from out of town discussing plans for the bridal shower. Her explanation sounded reasonable enough, but the tone of her voice during the call played over and over in Michael's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't being entirely truthful. In the days that followed, the signs became harder to ignore. Grace's absences became more frequent, and her explanations more vague. She would leave the house for hours at a time, claiming she was meeting with vendors or finalizing plans. Yet when Michael pressed for details, her answers seemed evasive, and he continued to show up at their home unannounced, always with some excuse to check in on the wedding. Michael's suspicions, once fleeting thoughts, began to solidify into something darker one night, after another unexplained absence. Michael confronted Grace. He asked her outright where she had been and why she hadn't answered her phone. Grace, visibly irritated, told him that he was being paranoid and that she had been with her friends, as she had told him earlier. Grace's frustration seemed forced, almost rehearsed, and Michael could no longer ignore the possibility that something was being hidden from him. The following day, while was out, Michael found himself drawn to her phone, which she had left on the kitchen counter. He had never invaded her privacy before, but the gnawing feeling in his gut drove him to pick it up. As he scrolled through her messages, he didn't find anything incriminating, at least not at first, but then buried among the usual conversations with friends and family, he saw a message from David. It was short and casual, but the familiarity of the tone caught Michael's attention. There was nothing explicit, but the subtext was clear. David and Grace were talking. More than he had realized, Michael's world began to spiral. He wanted to believe that it was all innocent, that he was reading too much into things, but the mounting evidence told a different story. The missed calls, the secretive behavior, the constant presence of his brother. It all pointed to something he wasn't ready to face. Michael decided it was time to confront David directly. He invited his brother over one evening under the pretense of discussing wedding preparations. They sat in Michael's living room, beers in hand, but the tension was palpable. Michael could no longer dance around the issue. He asked David outright if there was anything going on between him and Grace, anything that Michael should know about David. Unsurprisingly dismissed the question. He laughed it off, calling Michael paranoid and blaming the stress of the wedding for his doubts. "Come on," David said, grinning. "You're getting married soon, man. You're probably just overthinking everything." He assured Michael that Grace was just as in love with him as she had always been, and that there was nothing to worry about. Despite David's reassurances, Michael's suspicions didn't ease. If anything, his brother's overly casual response felt rehearsed. As if he had been expecting the question, David seemed too eager to push the conversation in a different direction, and Michael left the interaction feeling more uneasy than before. Michael's performance at work started to slip. His boss noticed his lack of focus, and co-workers began commenting on how distracted he seemed. Michael couldn't help it. His mind was consumed by the possibility of betrayal. He started coming home early, hoping to catch Grace in a lie. But every time she would have a plausible explanation for her whereabouts, still her stories felt increasingly disjointed. as if she was piecing them together on the spot one afternoon while Michael was running errands near the center of town. He decided to grab a quick lunch as he walked toward a nearby cafe. He stopped dead in his tracks. Through the large windows of the cafe, he spotted Grace, sitting at a table. With David, they were laughing together, leaning in close, their body language unmistakably intimate. They were sitting much too close for just in-laws to be. Grace had told Michael earlier that she was meeting with her friends to discuss last-minute wedding details, but here she was with David, and her posture was anything but casual. Michael's heart raced as he watched them, torn between confronting them immediately and retreating before they saw him. He stood frozen outside the cafe, trying to convince himself that it was just a friendly meeting between his fiancée and his brother, but the longer he watched, the harder it became to maintain that illusion. They were too comfortable, too familiar. Grace and David eventually stood up to leave, and Michael quickly moved out of sight, hiding behind a nearby building. He watched as they walked down the street together, close enough that their arms brushed occasionally. The casualness of their interaction, the way they seemed so at ease with each other, only deepened Michael's sense of betrayal that night. Michael couldn't bring himself to confront Grace. He lay awake beside her, his mind racing with doubts and suspicions every time she shifted in her sleep. He wondered if she was dreaming about David. He thought about the cafe, the laughter, the subtle touches. He couldn't shake the image from his mind. There were moments when everything seemed perfectly normal. Grace would go shopping, meet her friends, and come home without anything suspicious happening. But there were also times when she would disappear for hours, her explanations vague and unconvincing. Michael felt as though he was living in two realities in one. He was simply a man preparing for his wedding, dealing with the usual stresses that came with planning a major life event in the other. He was a betrayed fiancé watching the moment he loved slip away from him into the arms of his brother. The more he tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, the more real his suspicions became. He thought about confronting Grace again, demanding answers, but the fear of hearing the truth kept him silent. He didn't know if he could handle confirmation of his worst fears. Then one evening, while Michael was at home alone, he received a message on his phone. It was from an unknown number, but the contents sent a shockwave through his entire body. The message was short and cryptic, consisting of a single line. "You need to know the truth." Attached to the message was a video file. Michael's hands trembled as he clicked to open the video. What he saw was a brief, grainy clip of Grace and David together in David's apartment. The video was unmistakable. It showed them in each other's arms, their faces close, sharing a kiss that shattered any remaining illusions Michael had tried to cling to. The timestamp on the video was from the previous day. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The day of the wedding arrived, and everything seemed perfect. The venue was stunning, the weather calm, and every detail of the event had been meticulously planned. Friends and family gathered to celebrate, all smiles and laughter. And for a brief moment, Michael allowed himself to forget the dark cloud that had been hanging over him for the past few weeks. Grace, radiant in her white dress, looked more beautiful than ever, and as she walked down the aisle towards him, Michael felt a fleeting sense of peace. During the ceremony, Michael's doubts and fears seemed distant, almost irrelevant. He was surrounded by people who loved him, and in that moment, standing before Grace, he convinced himself that maybe he had been overthinking everything as they exchanged vows and rings. Michael looked into her eyes and told himself that this was real. She was his wife now, and were starting a new life together. The ceremony concluded with applause, and for the first time in a long while, Michael smiled without reservation. As the evening wound down, Michael found himself standing on the balcony of the reception hall, staring out at the darkening sky. The quiet of the moment allowed his mind to wander back to the events of the previous days. Grace's secrecy, David's too frequent presence, and the ominous message he had received on his phone. He had spent so long convincing himself that he was just being paranoid, but the doubts persisted. When it was finally time to leave Michael and Grace bid farewell to their guests. They returned home, exhausted but happy, or at least that's how Grace seemed. Michael's mind, however, was racing as they stepped through the front door. Grace gave him a tired smile, clearly looking forward to putting the day behind them. Michael was about to suggest they call it a night when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a congratulatory message from a friend or family member. Instead, it was an unknown number. Just like the message he had received earlier, his heart sank as he opened the text. Dreading what he might find, the message contained a video file. For a moment, Michael hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. He knew what it was. Deep down, he knew exactly what he was about to say, but he couldn't stop himself. He clicked on the video, and his worst fears were confirmed. The footage was shaky and low quality, likely filmed with a phone. But it was clear enough. Grace and David were together. In what looked like David's apartment, they were lying in bed. The video was dated, and as Michael stared at the timestamp, the last bit of hope he had crumbled away. The video had been recorded the day, the wedding hours, before Grace had promised to spend the rest of her life with him. For a moment, Michael stood frozen, his mind racing as he tried to process what he had just seen. Everything about the day, about the past few months, came crashing down around him. Grace oblivious to the storm brewing inside. Michael had already made her way upstairs to change out of her wedding dress. Michael could hear her moving around, humming softly, still unaware of what he had just discovered. He stared down at his phone, rewatching the video each second, making the betrayal feel more visceral, more real. The people he trusted most in the world had been deceiving him all along. As the weight of the realization settled in, Michael felt a surge of emotions, rage, sorrow, humiliation, all swirling together in a violent storm. His hands shook as he clenched his phone, the screen still displaying the damning evidence of his fiancée's affair with his own brother. Every glance they had exchanged, every smile they had shared, now took on a dark meaning Michael could hear Grace calling to him from upstairs, asking if he was coming to bed. Her voice, so familiar now, felt like a dagger twisting in his chest. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, gripping the banister, his mind racing through 1,000 different scenarios. Grace called for him again, her voice soft, unaware of the turmoil raging inside him. Michael didn't answer. He just stood there staring up the stairs, feeling the last remnants of his life as he knew it, slipping away without saying a word to Grace. Michael stood up and grabbed his jacket. The house felt stifling, as though it was suffocating him. He needed to get out to clear his head, but most of all, he needed answers. He slammed the front door behind him and made his way towards David's house, which was only a few blocks away. Each step fueled his anger, pushing him closer to the inevitable confrontation. When he arrived at David's home, Michael didn't hesitate. He pounded on the door, his heart racing with adrenaline. David opened the door, greeting him with a surprised but friendly expression. Unaware of what was about to happen to David, this was just another night. But to Michael, it was the culmination of weeks of suspicion, of betrayal, of everything he had tried to ignore. David barely had time to say a word before Michael pushed his way inside his eyes, locked on his brother with a fury that was impossible to disguise. The two stood in the hallway, the tension palpable. David, sensing something was wrong, tried to calm his brother, but Michael wasn't interested in pleasantries or explanations. "What the hell is going on between you and Grace?" Michael's voice was low, but the anger behind it was unmistakable. His hands were shaking, his body trembling with the force of the emotions he had been holding back for so long. David, clearly caught off guard, tried to brush it off, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but Michael wasn't listening. Each word David spoke only made the situation worse. To Michael, his brother's attempt to downplay the affair was the ultimate insult. The rage that had been simmering inside him for weeks finally boiled over in a moment of uncontrollable fury. Michael's gaze landed on a metal pipe lying by the door, likely a piece of equipment David had been working with earlier. Without thinking, Michael grabbed it, his vision narrowing as he felt the cold metal in his hands. David's eyes widened in fear as he realized what was happening, but it was too late. In a blind rage, Michael swung the pipe at David's head. The sound of the impact echoed through the house, followed by the sickening thud of David's body hitting the floor. Blood began to pool around David's head. And for a moment, Michael stood frozen, staring down at his brother. The reality of what he had just done hadn't fully set in yet. David lay on the ground unmoving. The pool of blood grew larger, and Michael began to panic. He dropped the pipe, his hands trembling as he knelt beside David, shaking him, trying to get some response, but there was none. David's chest wasn't rising. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the weight of what he had done finally sank in. His brother was dead. He had killed him. The shock hit Michael like a tidal wave, crashing over him and pulling him under. He couldn't believe what had just happened. One moment of blind fury had taken everything from him. David was gone. Michael tried to revive him, slapping his face, shaking his shoulders, but it was pointless. The blood pouring from David's head told him everything he needed to know. David wasn't coming back. The brother he had known his entire life, the man he had grown up with, shared memories with, was gone. And it was his fault. For several minutes, Michael sat in silence, unable to think, unable to move. His entire world had shattered in an instant. The man he had known his whole life, his own blood was dead at his hands. The shock was paralyzing. All the rage, all the betrayal now seemed distant, irrelevant compared to the horror of what he had done. As the minutes passed, Michael's panic grew. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he also couldn't stay there, staring at his brother's body forever. Outside neighbors had heard the commotion earlier, but had hesitated to interfere. Now, after hours of silence, some became concerned. The noise of the earlier argument and the sudden quietness afterwards seemed suspicious. One of them finally called the police, reporting the disturbance at David's house. It wasn't long before the authorities arrived. 2 squad cars pulling up quietly, their blue and red lights cutting through the darkness when the officers knocked on the door. Michael made no effort to escape or hide what had happened. He opened the door slowly. Slowly, his face pale, his clothes stained with blood, the officers immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. They entered the house cautiously, weapons drawn, and found David's body in the hallway. The scene was unmistakable. There had been violence, and it was clear who was responsible. Michael stood in the doorway, dazed but cooperative. He didn't resist as the officers placed him in handcuffs, reading him his rights. He simply nodded, his mind too clouded to reassess their words as they escorted him to the patrol car. He cast one last glance at David's lifeless form, knowing that everything in his life had changed irreversibly in that moment back at the police station. Michael was questioned by detectives. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints were all over the pipe. The blood on his clothes was unmistakably David's. And there were multiple witnesses who had heard the altercation. He didn't attempt to deny what he had done. In a cold, detached voice, Michael confessed to killing his brother, explaining that it had been an emotional outburst, an act of blind rage fueled by betrayal. He admitted that he had been overcome by the pain of discovering his fiancée's affair with David, but he insisted that the murder had not been premeditated. The investigation moved quickly. The case against Michael was straightforward, and there was no need for a lengthy trial. The public, however, became captivated by the story. It made headlines in the local papers and soon spread to national news outlets. The media portrayed Michael as a man driven to madness by jealousy and betrayal. The affair between Grace and David, the tragic wedding day revelation, and the brutal murder, these details were too sensational to ignore. Grace, meanwhile, was left in shock. The life she had built with Michael was shattered in an instant. She distanced herself from the media and avoided all public attention. But her involvement in the affair with David became a subject of intense scrutiny. Some viewed her as a victim, while others blamed her for triggering the tragic chain of events. Grace's life would never be the same, and the guilt of her role in the tragedy would follow her for years to come. When the case finally went to court, Michael's defense team argued that he had acted in a moment of emotional turmoil, that the murder was not premeditated, but rather a spontaneous reaction to the discovery of the affair. They hoped for a reduced sentence, citing his clean record, his career as an engineer, and the otherwise stable life he had led before the incident. However, the prosecution painted a different picture to them. Michael's actions were those of a dangerous individual who had taken the law into his own hands, brutally murdering his brother in cold blood. The courtroom was filled with tense silence as the jury deliberated. Public interest in the case had only grown during the trial, with people across the country following every development. The murder of a brother over an affair was the kind of scandalous story that captured the public imagination. But for Michael, the trial was simply a formality. He knew what the outcome would be. He had confessed to everything, and there was no question about his guilt when the verdict was read. It was as expected: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Michael showed little reaction as the words were spoken. There was no sense of relief, no plea for mercy, just an overwhelming sense of resignation. He had already come to terms with the fact that his life was over. Michael was transferred to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence, a supermax prison in Colorado, known for housing some of the most dangerous criminals in the country. The facility was infamous for its extreme security measures and isolation. For Michael, it would become his new home, the place where he would spend the rest of his life. Life in AG's floor was stark and unforgiving. Michael was confined to a small cell for 23 hours a day with minimal human contact and no hope of ever being released. The monotony of prison life was broken only by the constant reminders of his actions in the silence of his cell. Michael had nothing but time to reflect on the choices that had led him there. He replayed the events of that fateful night over and over in his mind, wondering how things might have turned out differently if he had only kept his emotions in check. The rage that had once consumed him was now replaced by regret. The life he had wanted, the family he had dreamed of, was gone forever. His actions had destroyed everything he had held dear. His parents, devastated by the loss of both their sons, refused to visit him. Grace had moved on her life, irreparably changed, but free of the legal consequences that now defined Michael's existence alone in his cell. Michael realized that his punishment extended far beyond the prison walls. The greatest punishment was living with the knowledge of what he had done, the realization that one moment of uncontrolled anger had cost him everything. Thank you for being with me so far in the video. If you like it, and subscribe to our channel to see more videos. Thank you all.